Hi, everyone.
Holly, thank you for that. It was really informative. I got so much good stuff out of it. I'm just wondering very quickly, for a brand new teacher who doesn't know really what emerging language is, give us that definition one more time, would you?
So yeah, emerging language is all the things that come up in lesson that we haven't planned for. It's things, it's not anything maybe that comes from our textbooks necessarily. It's not the target language. It's not the stuff we've planned to teach, but it's the things that maybe the students ask for, the things we notice. And so yeah, as a new teacher, when I first started teaching, it's difficult. It's not something that I was really comfortable with doing straight away. But like I said, incorporating a little bit slowly, every time you having that piece of paper, making sure you write things down when the students are speaking, or during a listening activity, listening for any useful vocabulary that you might want to give them. It's all a good starting point, and it becomes more natural with time, I would say.
I think you're probably right. It's not the easiest thing to do, because as new teachers, we're often just desperate to stick to the plan and get to the end of the lesson without making a fool of ourselves, right? We're very nervous when we start, so going off piste like this can be quite difficult. One thing that is interesting is when we think about emergent language, we think about vocab an awful lot, and it's more than vocabulary, isn't it? It's not just about words that students don't understand.
Yeah, or like I said at the end, if I had a class of students and they're all mispronouncing the ed past simple endings, that's not a vocab point, but it's something that I probably want to work on. Maybe it's not in my book, but it's something that I might work on in that moment, or I might plan to work on in a subsequent lesson. So it doesn't have to be just vocab based. It can also be grammar based, or functional language. It can be different things rather than just specific words and expressions.
Yeah, and that's great, because I think this is a big mistake that a lot of people make when they think about emergent language, is that actually emergent language is listening for new words and writing it up on the corner of the board. and it is about far more than that, isn't it? One thing that worries me a little bit as a teacher is this takes a lot of planning. Is it true?
Well, I mean, it's stuff that happens on the spot, so you can't necessarily plan for it, I would say. I mean, I don't think students expect us to be human dictionaries or human grammar books. We're not, we do our best, but we aren't. So I think no there's no harm in saying, I don't necessarily have that right now, but I'll get back to you in 10 minutes. Often when you're put on the spot, your mind goes blank. It's happened to me many, many, many times. And then 5 minutes later, it will come back to me and I'll go, oh yeah, that was what I was talking about, everyone. Let's go through it now. So I think it's, being honest with your students, and giving yourself time, not putting too much pressure on yourself if you can't remember in that exact moment. They're not trying to test us. They're just asking us questions for things they want to say, or things they want to write, or things they hear.
I think you're right. I think really, whenever we think about a lesson that has this non-book based time, automatically our mind goes to, I'm going to have to do something else, because with my book I have a lesson plan and I know what's coming next. So I think there is that worry about extra planning. My thought is not so much in planning in the lesson where the emergent language comes out, but then we're going to have to keep a note of that emergent language, aren't we? And then revisit it at some time. We can't just deal with it in that one class in that moment. Surely we have to go back to this.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think Neil wrote a comment along those lines in the chat. I think, yes, I mean, now we all have access to technology in our classrooms, or lots of us do. So I think a Word document or a PowerPoint slide is your best friend. If you note all of these things down in a digital format, you can then email it to students. You can also then open it up the next lesson, review it, do a nice gap fill. So you can kind of recycle it. It's not emerging in your next lesson, but you're at least recycling it and reusing it in some way, I would say.
And so really, there is definitely this nice continuity from lesson to lesson, even though we're dealing with stuff that we hadn't planned to come up, which is nice. It's good. How then do we answer those teachers who say, it takes up too much time of my lesson. I don't have the time to deal with this. I can deal with one or two things maybe, but I just don't have time to deal with it.
I
What do
think
we
it's
think about that?
it's tricky, and I don't have a perfect answer for that because we are under pressure. Like I said, we're under time pressure. We have things we have to cover, but I think it's about thinking about prioritizing things. Yes, you might have an activity in the book, but you might look at it and go, actually, it's not really relevant to my students. It's not relevant to their interests. But here they're asking me things that they really want, language they need. They want to use it outside the classroom. They want to use it to complete activities. And then if we don't give it to them, we're kind of leaving them at a disadvantage, maybe in some way, and we're just prioritizing what's in our book over what they want and what they need. So I think they should always be at the forefront of our minds. Our lessons should be dictated by our students, not by a book that we've been given to teach from.
Ooh,
That's my
that
opinion
that
on that.
that sounds a little bit like dogma. In what way is dogma a dogma approach different to emerging language in that case?
Oh, that's a very good question, Steve. So for me, dogma is completely unplanned. I have done some dogma lessons in my time, and I've gone in with nothing really apart from what emerges, what comes up during the lesson. But I think emergent language isn't a whole lesson. It's a section of a lesson. It's maybe something you deal with after your speaking activity. Maybe it's after some language works. It doesn't have to just be skills based. It could be after a listening or after a reading. Maybe you've done the reading skills work, the kind of the skimming, the scanning, and then you've pre-taught any blocking vocab beforehand. And then there's maybe a bit more language in that reading, in that article, that you think, oh, that's quite nice. Let's pick that out and let's maybe expand on it. So I think it's different to dogma in that way because there is a focus, and then maybe you go slightly off piste, and then you come back, and there is something to work from in the beginning.
So it's not totally the open book style of dogma where anything is on the table, really. Yeah,
No, I
good.
mean
I like that.
there's nothing.
I
I have
think,
tried that, but
yeah,
so
it's not my favorite style. I'm too much of a control freak to really get into dogma. I like to know where I'm going. Um,
yeah,
but hey, I really do enjoy dealing with emergent language in class. I know that if Gabby was with us today, she'd be saying, ignore emergent language. We don't like to deal with it. But I actually agree with you. I think it's a really important thing, and I think it's a really useful thing. Neil
and
had a point. Oh, sorry, go on.
sorry, I was just going to say some of my best lessons have been stuff that has emerged, especially I think people in the chat were talking about higher level lessons, high level students. And I think there's some really interesting things that can come out. And I have lots of students who come to me and say, I was on, in London, I was on the Underground and I saw this poster, and what does this word mean? Or I read this in a book, or I was listening to this song and the singer said XYZ. And so I think it's stuff you can really react to, and it's interesting, and it's interesting for, I think, as a teacher, and it's interesting for the students as well. So
It's great. And how many times as London-based teachers have we had the how to pronounce names on the
yes,
Underground lesson? I mean, we get students asking us this all the time, right?
yeah,
But yeah, students, particularly students who have traveled for their language and they are in the UK or the States or Australia, and they're surrounded by English all the time. They come to class with so many questions, don't they?
yeah.
Is that something we should encourage, do you think?
I mean, I think so. I know, as a new teacher, I found questions very daunting. I'm sure you did as well, Steve. Not having the perfect answer or the perfect pre-planned answer. But I think it is okay to say, let me get back to you, make a note of it if you're not 100% sure. But also, I think yeah, it does come, it takes time, it takes practice, and it becomes more natural. And I think you have some really nice conversations with your students if you're able to have that open dialogue where they trust you enough to ask you things, and they know that if you don't tell them straight away, you will tell them maybe in the next lesson, or you might pop them an email and let them know. So I think that's nice. It's a nice thing to do.
Definitely. I have two things that have come up in the chat box. One from Smetna and one from Neil. I'm going to just talk to Neil's first about Neil's first because he was earlier. Neil said, by definition, emergent language is unplannable because it just happens. But is there an element of it that we can plan? Can we predict what's going to come up? You know, prediction is a big favorite thing of mine. Can we predict the emergent language? Does that help? Should we spend time predicting emergent language that might come up?
That is a very good question. I think if you're thinking about doing working with emergent language, if it's coming from maybe a skills lesson, so I'm thinking maybe a reading lesson where you've got a reading passage, maybe you might just obviously have a read of the text yourself before you teach it, look for any blocking vocab to start with, but you might look at a few expressions in there, a few words. You might think, I'm not sure if they know them. They might ask me. I'm not going to sit and plan a definition for that. And I might have a few seconds think about any related expressions connected to those. So possibly you could, but again, you don't know the question that's going to be asked, but you might prepare yourself a little bit for possible questions in those areas. And if they happen, they happen. If they don't, they don't.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's hard, isn't it, to predict, and also it can end up being a bit of a rabbit hole that you fall down, and you just, where do you stop, really, is the problem. So I think you're right. Let's see what comes up. Smetna's question, or a point, which I think is really quite valid, is about, she talks about C1 students having 30 words on a page and it's already too much. My add-on to that would be, for any students really, do we risk, by adding all of this extra emergent language, some of it is being pushed then to demand high, do we risk just blowing people's minds and taking it too far with them?
I mean, I always harp on about this. It's about knowing your students, isn't it? It's knowing what they need. And so you might have one particular student who wants to know one specific expression or wants to say something in a certain way. Maybe you sit down with them for a second and you write it in their notebook for them, or you talk to them about it, and you keep your class board possibly for things that you think are relevant to everyone. So yeah, not overloading them. I don't want to have an emerging language column on my board which is full of 57 different expressions from one lesson. I try and be focused on the topic, because it is a rabbit hole. You could go in any different direction, but keeping clear what are your lesson aims, what is the topic you're talking about, maybe trying to keep it topic related, because then you're narrowing it down slightly, but having space for possible unrelated questions as well.
Yeah, keeping it within the context of what we're supposed to be teaching, I guess, right? But yeah, and you're right. Isn't it always, it's always the same answer, isn't it? Know your students, know your students. Forget that we teach English, we teach students, and the students are more important than the language, aren't they? It's knowing what fits that group at that time. And just because it worked this morning doesn't mean it's going to work with the group this afternoon. That's like, know your students is the key to being a good teacher. I was going to say, tell you about a terrible thing that happened to me when I was a very new teacher, really. I was teaching in France and went off to a company to teach a group of students. And the lesson was supposed to be about welcoming visitors to the company, and that's really what they wanted, was a workshop on welcoming visitors. And when we got there, actually, it turned out that they knew how to welcome visitors, and the problem that most of them were having was taking visitors down to the canteen at lunchtime and helping them understand what's on the menu and helping them get food that's working for their diet and that kind of stuff. So we had a really good lesson based around the canteen, and lots of good stuff, and lots of really good language in there. And when I got back to the school the next day to collect books for the following day's lessons, the owner of the school was very cross with me and said that the HR department had heard that this had turned into a lesson about fruit. which it hadn't, and the lesson had gone too far off-piste. I was a really young student, young teacher, and I was giving them what I felt they wanted, and actually it was what they wanted, but it wasn't what the person who was paying the course wanted. Do we run the risk with emergent language of not giving the students what they think they're paying for? Because most of our students are paying for something, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a balance, isn't it? You know, especially I work in a school where we use course books, and we have a syllabus that adheres to those course books. So if I'm teaching, I am mindful that my students have paid for the book and they expect to do an amount of the book, maybe not every page, but a decent proportion of it. And so it's being balanced and it's giving time. And maybe you have, if you teach them every day, you might have a specific lesson a week where you say this is the day where we're going to do lots of speaking, lots of skills work, and then there's going to be lots of vocab that comes out of this possibly. It depends how you work with your students, but you communicate with them, tell them what you're doing, tell them why you're doing it. I think we don't do that as enough as teachers. We do things and we're like, you know, I'm the teacher, I know why I'm doing it, but we don't always tell the students why are we doing this. You know, we write lesson objectives, why do we do it? To tell the students what they're learning in the class. And if we don't explain things to them, they don't know why we're doing things, and then there maybe is that miscommunication possibly. So
Yeah.
open dialogue, I think.
Open dialogue, managing expectations, and as you say, explaining why we're doing what we're doing. I know you ran a really great session, and if anybody wants to see a great session on lesson objectives, dig into the resources here at Gallery Teachers. You'll find Holly's amazing session on lesson objectives, and I'm wondering how you feed those two things together, because lesson objectives are very much this is what we're doing, and emergent language is off-piste.
I mean, again, I don't think lesson objectives are set in stone. I don't write them on the board and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I adapt them. So if things change, I go over and I change them and I adapt the objectives, and maybe I add a new one. So maybe we've done the ones I've got and the emergent language is now a kind of extra session or an extra part that I haven't planned for, but I'm going to add it as an objective, because then at the end we can tick them all off together and we can see what we've achieved. So they're not, I don't think objectives should be fixed all the time during the class. They can be adapted, and that's where the emergent language can come in as well.
Yeah, great. I think Joe also had a really good point about students picking out, the students being able to pick out what's relevant to them personally. And I think it's true, right? We need to give our students credit for being able to work out, okay, this part of the lesson isn't particularly applicable to me, so I'm not going to worry too much. Yeah. Good.
And they tell us, don't they? I think students are very vocal. They tell us the things they want to know and the things they don't, you know. Often if you're teaching adults, you know, sometimes with younger learners it's different, but my adults tell me anyway.
It's very true. Students will, and also teenagers will soon tell you if what they're learning isn't going to be useful to them. But again, it comes back to knowing your students, doesn't it? And knowing that this will be interesting to the vast majority of them, or this will only be interesting to that one student, and we can decide to handle it with that one student at break time, or while everybody's getting on with an activity. You know, there are moments to do things on there. It's about picking your time, I guess. News from Gabby is that she totally agrees with emergent language, and she thinks it's a really great way to teach. So that's a really good thing. You've done something good there. Yeah, me too as well. I think we all agree on that. Let's have a think. Iram Iqbal, she came up with a really good idea about using sticky notes in the classroom and
I saw that one.
did you see it? And turning it into a gallery walk activity. A really lovely activity. How do you feel about that? Because
I think that's great.
The one thing for me is that it makes a bit of a disconnect between when the language arrived and when we deal with that language. But tell me more. What do you think?
I think I like the idea. I like anything that gets students up and moving and out of their chairs and doing something interactive, and it's great. I think it depends when you do it, doesn't it? I mean, it would be nice. I guess it would be a really nice review activity, definitely. If if you are a fast writer and you're able to fill in post-it notes while you are monitoring, and then you're able to very quickly stick them around the room, then that's amazing. I don't know if I'd be that fast. But yeah, anything that gets students up and moving. I think things as well, getting them to come and write up on the board. So maybe you're projecting onto your whiteboard some of the things that you heard, some areas that you think they could reformulate or upgrade, and they come up and they annotate bits that they might change, even if they can't give you the upgrade or the reformulation, even if they just underline the part they think they could change. So they underline the adjective and say, maybe we could use a better adjective. That would be a really nice activity. It doesn't have to all be teacher focused of, I give you the language and I give you the expression or the grammar. I think they could do some of the work themselves, even if they don't have the ability to fill it in. But I mean, emergent language is gaps. It's things that students don't have, but it might be a gap for one or two students who you're listening to, but other students might not have that gap and they could give that to the others. So it's this idea of sharing knowledge as well, and students helping
Lovely.
each other and kind of co-teaching as well, isn't it? It's really nice. So
It's
we're,
really
we're
lovely
not the only people
that
who
peer
have the
teaching.
knowledge. Yeah,
No,
really
no,
nice.
and we forget that as teachers, don't we? We forget that actually, the students, some of the students will know this, and some of the students will know something else. It's always great.
Yeah.
The nice thing about Iram's activity actually is it solves me my problem from earlier, which is having to prepare something for the next lesson. Because if I've taken the time to write the emergent language down on some sticky notes, I can pull those same sticky notes out in a couple of days' time and we can return to them then. So that's a really nice way of being able to return to the same language and use it again. Let's see.
Good bit of recycling there.
Yeah, really nice. Neil has a point about one way that he's worked with emergent language is to start by asking students if they can identify areas which they would benefit from. If they would benefit from ungrading or recasting, and then work on the actual reformulation. So asking students what they want to work on. Is this good? Is it entering a danger zone?
So, well, I mean, it's all about how you handle it, isn't it? It's all about, I said the 10th time I've said this today, it's about knowing your students, knowing what you think they are able to do and what they are willing to do. I guess I have some students I'm thinking of who wouldn't like that because they find it quite difficult to notice their own areas for improvement, for example, and they expect me to do that as their teacher. And so that's okay. I have some students who are very independent who'd be happy to do this. So I think it would be a nice thing to do. I think it depends on the level as well, doesn't it? I think for lower levels that would be very challenging. For higher levels it could be quite nice, especially I'm thinking exam classes. That could be quite a nice nice activity for kind of an IELTS type class. Yeah.
Really cool. Yeah, I like it. Neil, with his mind on digital things, says stickly notes, and we could do stickly notes on Padlet. Yes, Padlet is great. Yeah. Ladies and gents, don't forget your digital bits because there's so much out there that will help with this. Yes, for sure. And Neil says yes. You'd need to be B1 plus for it to work. Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree. How do you deal with, when you're talking emergent language, particularly with vocab, maybe some fixed expressions as well, stuff that is really not very frequently occurring. So students come across a word, particularly with higher levels when we're dealing with authentic material, or even a lower level when we're dealing with some authentic materials as well. They're going to come across some very rarely occurring words. Is it worth dealing with them? Is it worth explaining, or do we give it to them as dictionary homework?
I think it depends. I mean, I always feel like if a student asks me a question directly in class, then I want to try and give them an answer if I can, if I have the time and the ability to do it in that moment. And so I might deal with it probably quite briefly, but I would probably then do more work on what else would we say instead, which is much more common. So there's, kind of a bit of work on register, maybe be things that I often students ask for things that are only really used when we write. So I might give them the kind of spoken alternative instead. So I do like to try and answer as many questions as I can within, you know, within my ability and within the time that I have in the classroom, or I tell them I'll come back to it. But I think, yeah, if they ask, then there's probably a reason they've asked. And then if we give them something more commonly occurring, then that's just, again, expanding their lexical range, and that's a good thing. My
Fab.
light
Oh,
has
your
gone
lights
off
went
behind
out.
me.
Joe talks about taking a photo of the board as well as a way to keep track of emergent language for the next session. I think that's a great idea. I'm going to go back to new teachers or less experienced teachers again. And you talked about one of my favorite things, which I always keep an eye on when I'm observing lessons: MFP, meaning, form, and prompt. How important is MFP, and how important is context?
I mean,
Please say very.
very
Please say
important.
very.
Yeah. Wouldn't dare say it's not. No,
Yeah.
it is very, very, very important. Yes, and I
Good.
mean, if I put a word up on the board in isolation without any context, without any information about what type of word it is it a verb, is it a noun, how can I expect a student to ever be able to use it again in the future? Because it's just a word. They'll see it in that. They might not even write it down, for one, because they're like, what is this word? And then if they have written it down, they'll never be able to use it again necessarily, because they just don't have enough information about it, unless they're a very diligent student and they're going to sit at home and look up in the dictionary of every word that comes up in class, which is unlikely, unfortunately. So I think, yeah, always giving them the context. Because if you give a really good context and a really good example sentence, you don't even always need to give the meaning, because it's clear from the example and the context that you've given, and you can elicit the meaning, which is much better than me telling the students what it means. And also they can elicit the form. So I think everything starts from a really good example in context, which then the form, the meaning comes from. Yeah, I mean, and I'm not saying this is easy, because, you know, as a new teacher, we don't have all these examples coming out of our head straight away.
No.
But again, practice and time, you surprise yourself the things you can think of under pressure, and it becomes easier. It definitely does.
It definitely does, doesn't it? But yeah, you're right. One thing that we learn to be really good at as teachers is thinking on our feet and coming up with examples quickly, right? Oh my goodness, there are so many advantages to being a teacher. It keeps your brain alive, doesn't it? For sure.
Yeah.
Florin, who I think is possibly the most fantastic person in the world, because not only did Florin say context, but Florin said collocations. And I love giving MFP, context, and collocations.
Yep.
How do you feel
Definitely.
about that, Holly Morgan?
Yeah, I mean, great. I mean, I also agree. I think I gave an example of that in the input session. Yeah, you know, giving them, I can't remember what I had now. I've got a mind blank. What did I use in my example? But things like, if we're looking at, I don't know, they asked for the word in, this happened to me. A student asked me what the word was for the bin in the classroom. And so then I think we had, you know, type of bin, recycling bin, green bin, black bin, as we have in the UK. And then we had take the bins out. So we kind of went through all of these possible things. I mean, within, you know, 5 or 10 minutes, a little diversion. And so, yeah, collocations and extra information is always good, because that's how they're going to find it themselves in context when they read, when they listen to other people, when they listen to music or watch TV. That's how they'll find. They're not going to see words in isolation. They're going to see them in context within collocations or other expressions as well.
Yeah, I think it's really good, isn't it? I think when we deal with semi-fixed expressions as well, it's really nice to think how those can be expanded in different ways and where they can use those words. And also, sometimes it's good to think about appropriacy as well. You know, where can I use this word? Where shouldn't I use this word? Particularly, you know, English is full of slang and full of things. Words like hangry, for example, you possibly wouldn't say it to your mother-in-law on the first time you meet her, right? I don't know. Maybe you would.
Yeah, no, those things are important. Yeah, giving them the register and when you would use it, when you wouldn't, what context. Yeah, especially slang and things like that. It's really important, isn't it? So, and I
Super
think,
important.
you know, we do these things normally. I think even as a newer teacher, I had these thoughts when things were coming up in class, and then, you know, I keep saying with practice, but with practice it just becomes second nature, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think my final point on this really would be that we do a lot of this anyway, don't we? It's like a lot of things that happen in the classroom that we do it, and then we discover that this has a name, and that there's actually reading that we can do about this, and learning we can do about this, because as a brand new teacher, we might not know that emergent language exists as a concept within ELT or within language teaching, regardless of language. But we know that when students ask questions, we answer them, and we do our best to make sure that students have learned what from that answer.
Yeah.
So my parting shot would be just that, really. We do it anyway, but now we have a name for it, and we've discovered that this is called emergent language. Let's find out more. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, there's loads of reading on it, and actually I could do a bit of a shameless plug. I went to a fantastic IA TEFL presentation in Belfast a few months ago by Danny Chin, no, Richard Chin and Danny Norrington Davies. Apologies if I got those wrong. Who work at IH London, who are actually have published a book. It's coming out later this year called Emerging Language, which I think would be a really great place to start in terms of reading. There's lots of blogs online. Some of them I put in my summary for this session. So there's lots of work on it. I think it's having more research into it, and there's more talk about it in methodology books. So I think there's lots of things to find out, and there's lots of activities and ideas you can find online as well in terms
For
of
sure.
thinking about emergent language.
For sure. And Neil's point is that emergent language is not new. Absolutely. I wasn't saying emergent language is new. I'm saying for some people who are with us today, this might be the first time you've heard about it, in which case follow Holly's tips and read up some more and see what you can find out more about dealing with this in your classroom.
Oh, one question, Holly. Sorry.
Mhm.
You mentioned previously that you want to when you teach adult student, you would want to know about your student. But as you know, in the summer, a lot of students are coming for 1 week, 2 weeks. How can teacher use this emerging language skill in the classroom, even just for these short-term students that you don't know much about them?
Yeah, no, it is hard when you have lots of new students. I think it's hard, but it depends on your class size. It depends how many students you've got. But whenever I have a new student, I try and have a 2 or 3 minute chat with them, either at the beginning of the class when they join, or at the end, or during the class if I have a moment, just to find out a little bit about them. I get them to kind of introduce themselves to each other if they're new, and that gives me a bit of information about them to start with. And I normally, on a first lesson with that student, or 1 or 2 new students, I don't ignore my other students, of course, but I pay a bit more attention to them when monitoring, because I want to find out about them. I want to find out about them as people, you know, where they're from, if they're working in different industries, what their background is, and then what they're interested in as well, but also what their language ability is like, where the gaps are, where are the things I can help with. Because, you know, in 1 week, we're not expecting them to make huge improvements, but I really want them to have got something useful out of my classes, even if it's for a really short period of time. So yeah, trying to talk to them and giving them that personal experience as much as we can, even though it's tricky. We don't have much time.
Yeah, right. Just before we go, any more question in the chat room?
Neil was talking a little bit there about how emergent language works really well with project work, and how if you're doing project-based learning, which works really well with teens, young adults, project-based learning is great, and how emergent language works really well with that as a lesson type. So definitely project-based learning is something that I think is interesting to read up on for everyone.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. It's connected, isn't it? And it's definitely where that's when you're going to get lots of questions from students, because they're trying to work together and they need language. So that's a really good one.
Yeah, they're going to get lots of lovely stuff from that.
In terms of there was reflective question we had. Maybe if we could just quickly cover that, the reflective question that we have for this masterclass.
Yeah. Let me find them.
The first question is, how often do you work with emerging language in the classroom, and how confident do you feel doing this?
Florence says they use emergent language as often as possible, almost in every lesson, and I think that's a great way to go, Florence.
Yeah, that's fab. Really, really good.
And the second question for the reflective question is, how do you currently share the emerging language with your student? Is this the best way of doing it?
I think this is where Iran's wonderful thought about post-it notes comes in, and Neil's thoughts about Padlet are also very good. Yeah.
Definitely.
There's a question from Kaki. Yeah, what kind of role does teacher makes difference in learning?
I think the teacher makes a difference in learning if the teacher is listening. I think the teacher that makes the biggest difference is a listening teacher.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and a responsive teacher, which I think is part of listening, isn't it? If you listen well, you can then respond appropriately. Yeah.
Neil says, have a handbook notebook handy. Jot down examples, deal with it there and then or in a later class. Exactly. Choose your time, right, Holly?
Yeah, and choose your method of note taking. I am known for having scraps of paper, whatever works for you, whatever you have to hand, or an extra worksheet folded over. Or I have some on my teaching team who take notes on their phones, and then they can then open that online straight away after the speaking. So it depends how technologically savvy you are, but whatever method works for you, then stick with it.
Maybe, Neil, do you want to share your, because I can see Neil has, would you like to share something over the phone, over the microphone?
Hi there, Janice. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Neil.
Yeah. Hi, Neil.
Hi there, Holly. Thank you so much. Brilliant session and so many practical, easy to implement ideas. I think Gabby's made a fantastic point when she talks about the fact that if this isn't taught in initial teacher training, how does teachers get the confidence to start going with it? Some teachers just kind of do it spontaneously, I think. And I guess, I don't know if you'd agree, Holly, Steve, Gabby, one way of thinking about this is that, you know, on a CELT or something like a CELTA, we will always encourage teachers to try and think about a feedback session in the last 5-10 minutes of the session, which often is a...
Oh, we've lost you.
Oh, sorry.
Hello? Lost Neil.
Sorry, I got... Okay, I'll say that in. So on CELTAs, we often encourage people to have a feedback session at the end, but that's typically an error correction session. It's not a big jump to rethink that error correction session as a upgrade your language session. So as an example, if you've got a business person who said, oh, I employed someone to go out and to talk people on the street to ask questions using a questionnaire, you can upgrade that to, I employed a specialist to do some market research.
Yes.
So it's not that what the person said was, so you're not focusing on you made a grammar mistake or you've got the wrong word.
It's an upgrade.
Naturalizing the language, giving an upgrade. So I think, you know, it's not actually that different, and maybe that's a way to give people confidence if they haven't done it before. The students love it.
Definitely.
They really do.
Yeah, they do. My students love it. Yeah, and those are some really good points. So I think I probably naturally started doing what you were saying. I was error correcting, and then I was like, oh, well, I heard that, and it's not wrong, but they could say it in a better way. So I think maybe, you know, in my role with my teaching team, it's something that I look for in observations. I look for error correction. I also look for emerging language. teach all of my teaching team to have emerging language column, how to use it, when to use it. So maybe it doesn't come on initial teacher training courses, but it comes as you start teaching, I think. And
Yeah.
you know, if you have, fingers crossed, a great manager who's helping you to develop, then that's something that can come then, I think, as well. And it's part of your natural development, I think, as a teacher, as you get more confident.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think you're right, Holly, and I think that's where having somebody like Holly as a teacher training expert within the school is a real bonus, and those are the schools to work for, places where you're going to get lots of feedback and you're going to take your teaching to the next level, because without that your CELTA tends to just drift a little bit and we move away from CELTA and we move towards our own style of teaching. And having that program of observation and feedback for teachers is super important in any school. And often we fight against it as teachers. We don't like observation, but so important to our personal development.
We came across some teacher who maybe they have been teaching for many years, and it's either they have been teaching for many years or they only just become newly qualified teacher. They don't particularly like observation. They felt like, oh, someone is observing me, so there must be something wrong. So I think it's important as a director of study or academic manager have to explain to them what was the purpose, why do we need to do observation. It's not only just it's really to share idea and see what we can help support, especially the newly qualified teacher, in terms of what's happening in the classroom.
So I think that's it from Holly and myself, unless Holly, do you have anything that you want to add in?
I would end with saying, give it a go, have a try, be brave. Even if, you know, for 10 minutes of your class, it could be a disaster, but it doesn't matter. You know, I don't think I've always learned from the lessons that I thought were the worst, always the ones I learned the most from. So having a go, trying it out, and I think you'll see a really positive reaction from students, and that positive reaction will keep you wanting to do it more, because they get a lot from it. And I think as a teacher, we can get a lot from it ourselves as well. So be brave and see what happens. What's the worst that could happen? Nothing bad can happen from having a go at doing some emerging language in class.